Hey guys, tonight we are diving deep into the less glamorous corners of history, pulling back the curtain on some truly unenviable roles. Forget the knights in shining armor or the elegant ladies of the court. We're looking at the folks whose lives were frankly a bit of a slog, maybe even downright miserable. We're starting tonight with the court jester. Yes, the guy with the bells and the funny hat. You probably think you know the deal, right? Giggles jokes living the high life near the king. Let me tell you, the reality was a lot less ha-ha and a lot more, oh dear God, please don't lop off my head. It was a job where success meant precarious survival and failure could be permanent. Seriously, you probably wouldn't have survived this gig for a week. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Okay, so settle in. Close your eyes if you like. Just listen to the sound of my voice guiding you back. Way, way back. We're heading to a medieval castle. Forget the Disney version. This place is drafty, it smells faintly of mildew and cooking fires, and the stone walls sweat in the damp air. Torches flicker, casting dancing shadows, and the sounds are a mix of clanking armor, distant shouting, and the occasional bark of a hound. And there you are. You the jester. The common image, the one you probably have right now, is the guy in the brightly colored motley maybe doing a little jig, shaking the bells on his cap. He's always laughing, right? Always ready with a quip. Life of the party. That image is optimistic, let's say. The reality of being a court jester, especially when you were just starting out, was far removed from that cheerful caricature. It wasn't just a job, it was a precarious existence teetering constantly on the edge of disgrace or worse. Think about how you even got here. This wasn't a profession you chose from a list. There wasn't a university degree in advanced pratfalling or a vocational school for sarcastic observation. More likely, you were born into it. Perhaps your parents were itinerant performers and you showed a natural knack for mimicking people or making silly faces. Maybe you were an orphan, taken in by the court, and someone noticed you had a sharp tongue or could juggle 3 apples without dropping one. Or in some grim instances, you might have been brought into court precisely because of some perceived otherness or simple-mindedness kept for cruel amusement. Historians still argue whether the natural fool was genuinely intellectually simple or often feigning it to navigate the dangerous waters of court politics with a protective mask of ignorance. Your early life as a potential jester? Not glamorous? No comfy bed or fancy clothes, you were low on the totem pole. You probably slept in a drafty corridor or maybe a crowded servants' quarter, learning the ropes by watching others. The older, more established jesters, the traveling minstrels who passed through even just observing the ridiculously serious faces of the nobles. You learned to move quietly when you needed to, and loudly when it served you. You learned to listen, really listen to the gossip, the moods, the subtle shifts in power dynamics that could affect your life in an instant. Training wasn't formal, it was brutal on-the-job learning. You practiced juggling with rocks or misshapen potatoes. You learned to tumble and contort your body, often resulting in bruises that no one cared about. You practiced singing off-key or playing a lute badly on purpose, and then learning to play it beautifully to surprise people. You learned storytelling, often adapting old tales or inventing new ones on the spot based on the day's events. And you learned to gauge the temperature of a room, the mood of the lord or lady, because your ability to read the atmosphere was as important as your ability to tell a joke. A funny comment at the wrong moment could land you in the dungeon or worse. A perfectly timed, slightly veiled insult, though, could solidify your place, showing you had wit and daring. This early phase was mostly about survival and proving you had value beyond just being there. You weren't guaranteed food or shelter. You earned it piece by piece, performance by performance. It was a hustle. Imagine trying to be funny when you're cold, hungry, and terrified. It's the original tough crowd, except the audience was literally holding the power of life and death over you. The sheer amount of waiting you did as a young jester was immense. Waiting to be called upon. Waiting for the Lord to finish his meal. Waiting for the right moment to interject. Waiting for your turn among the various entertainers. the musicians, the acrobats, the storytellers. You were just one part of the chaotic, bustling, and often unsanitary environment of a medieval court. This isn't the history you see in movies. This is the slow, grinding reality. It's the cold stones against your back as you try to sleep, the constant, low-level anxiety, the endless practice of boring, repetitive skills until your fingers bled or your muscles ached. It's the pressure to be on when you felt anything but. It was less about being inherently hilarious and more about being strategically amusing, and that required a level of discipline and observation that the stereotype completely misses. You weren't just born funny. You honed it, scraped it out of the harsh edges of your existence day after boring, terrifying day. So you're there cold and anxious, honing your craft in the castle's periphery. But your craft wasn't just telling knock-knock jokes about knights and dragons. Though, let's be honest, that was probably part of the repertoire. Your skills had to be far broader, far deeper if you wanted to survive, and perhaps even thrive slightly. Think of yourself less as a stand-up comedian and more as a one-person entertainment troupe information broker, and sometimes dangerously a political commentator wrapped in a fool's cap. Beyond the basic tumbling and slapstick, you needed musical ability. Learning to play a lute, a pipe, or sing, perhaps badly on purpose for laughs but also competently to provide background music or accompany dances, was essential. Juggling balancing acts, simple magic tricks that would impress people who thought sneezing was caused by evil spirits. These were all tools in your kit. You weren't just performing for the court, you were often part of the texture of court life, providing ambient entertainment during meals or gatherings. But your most valuable skills weren't physical. They were mental and verbal. You needed a sharp mind, a quick wit, and an excellent memory. You had to remember names, faces, relationships, ongoing feuds, and delicate situations. You had to listen to conversations you weren't meant to hear and process that information rapidly. Because a jester wasn't just a passive entertainer. You were often a conduit for information, a living newspaper, in an age without printing presses or Twitter feeds. You traveled with the court, heard the gossip from kitchens to council chambers, and could disseminate it in a supposedly harmless, entertaining way. This made you surprisingly valuable. You knew who was sleeping with whom, who owed money to whom, and which lord was secretly plotting against another. Sharing this information cloaked in satire or song was a delicate dance. One of the most famous aspects of the jester's role, and a mainstream historical fact, is that they were often allowed to speak truths to power that no one else dared utter. While a nobleman might be executed for criticizing the king, a jester could, under the guise of foolishness, mock the king's decisions, his appearance, or his advisors. Oh my lord, your new tax collector is so honest, he wouldn't steal a coin, even if it were glued to his hand. Unless it was your hand, of course. It's a dangerous tightrope walk, using humor as a shield. You had to know exactly how far you could push, gauging the king's mood second by second. Misjudge it, and the shield might turn out to be made of tissue paper. This unique permission to speak freely also meant you were often privy to private moments. You might be called upon to entertain the king when he was alone or troubled. You saw him when the mask was off, when he wasn't performing for his court. This gave you a different kind of knowledge, a personal insight into his character, his fears, and his vulnerabilities. It's like being a fly on the wall in the Oval Office, except the fly occasionally does a somersault and tells a joke about the president's hat. Beyond entertainment and social commentary, jesters could find themselves in strangely specific, non-comedic roles. Sometimes a jester might be employed specifically because of a physical peculiarity or a unique talent unrelated to comedy. There are whispers in historical records of jesters who were also valued for their encyclopedic knowledge of folklore or their ability to mimic foreign accents, useful in diplomacy perhaps. One quirky tidbit: some jesters were reputedly kept around for their sheer ugliness or physical deformities, as these were sometimes seen as inherently amusing or even protective against the evil eye. Yes, your job might literally be, look funny, scare away bad luck. Not exactly the career path they outline in guidance counseling. You might also be tasked with simple, mundane duties that had nothing to do with making people laugh. Maybe you had to deliver messages that were too sensitive for a regular servant, but not important enough for a noble messenger. Perhaps you were expected to help care for the court's animals or run errands within the castle walls. You were, in essence, a jack of all trades, expected to turn your hand to whatever was needed, all while maintaining the persona of the slightly absurd fool. This required immense flexibility and adaptability. You couldn't just be the funny guy. You had to be reliable, observant, and capable of switching gears from performing a jig to delivering a coded note without missing a beat. Historians still debate whether jesters held any real political influence or if their privileged position was purely performative. Were they just a release valve for tension, allowing the court to laugh at itself briefly before returning to serious business? Or did their unique perspective and ability to speak plainly occasionally sway a ruler's opinion? It's hard to say definitively. Sometimes a joke can carry more weight than 1,000 formal arguments. Think about the pressure. You had to be on constantly when in the presence of the Lord. Your downtime was likely minimal and often interrupted. You lived in a constant state of performance, even when you weren't actively telling jokes. Every interaction, every movement could be judged. Were you acting like a fool? Were you entertaining enough? Were you stepping out of line? It was exhausting, demanding, and mentally taxing, far more complex than simply learning a few gags. Your skills were your shield, your weapon, and your livelihood all rolled into one motley package. Now imagine you've survived the initial grind. You're established, known within the court. You've got your motley, maybe even a preferred place near the high table. You're not just a jester, you're the jester for this particular lord or lady. Does life get easier? Oh, sweet child of the future, no. It just gets a different kind of hard. Your existence now hinges almost entirely on the unpredictable, volatile mood of your patron. The king's unpredictable mood is the central, terrifying variable in your life. One moment you might be showered with gifts, given fine clothes, or even granted a small piece of land for making the monarch laugh uproariously. The next, a poorly timed jest, a look that's misinterpreted, or simply the king being in a foul temper from a bad night's sleep or a political setback, could see you whipped, imprisoned, or even executed. There was no HR department, no union for jesters to appeal to. Your job security was as stable as a stack of juggling balls on a windy day. You had to become an expert in reading facial expressions, body language, and the subtle cues that indicated a shift in temperament. Was the king rubbing his temples? Best be quiet or offer only the gentlest humor. Was he booming with laughter at someone else's expense? Maybe now's the time for a carefully aimed barb at a rival courtier. It required constant hyper-vigilant attention. You were essentially a human mood ring for the monarch, except if you guessed wrong, you paid the price. Think about the stress of this. Every single interaction with the king, from the moment he woke up until he retired for the night, and sometimes even then if he couldn't sleep, was potentially a performance review with fatal consequences. You had to be ready to entertain, distract, or simply fade into the background depending on the moment. You needed the confidence to perform under pressure, but also the humility to know when to disappear. It's like doing improv comedy where the main audience member occasionally throws knives. A mainstream historical fact that underscores this peril is the story of Mathurin de Navarre, a female jester in the French court during the late 16th century. While she enjoyed significant favor and influence, even being sent on diplomatic missions, a quirky tidbit, her position was always dependent on navigating the treacherous political landscape and maintaining the capricious favor of figures like King Henry IV. It shows that even at the height of their potential influence, a jester's power was derived entirely from their proximity to the ruler, not from any inherent status or rights. This reliance on the king's mood wasn't just about avoiding punishment, it was about survival. Your food, your clothing, your shelter, any meager comforts you might have gained. They all flowed from his pleasure. If he was happy with you, life was tolerable, maybe even good by medieval standards. If he wasn't, you could find yourself out on the street, or worse, replaced by someone younger, funnier, or simply more sycophantic. This constant threat incentivized flattery and playing it safe, even when the jester's traditional role was to be daring and honest. It was a fundamental contradiction of the job. Historians still argue whether the license to speak granted to jesters was a genuine privilege, or simply a carefully managed illusion designed to make the monarch seem magnanimous while retaining absolute power? Did kings truly value the jester's honest insights, or did they tolerate them only as long as they were amusing and not too insightful? The truth likely lies somewhere in between, varying from monarch to monarch. Some rulers genuinely enjoyed the jester's company and wit, seeing them as a trusted confidant. Others viewed them purely as disposable entertainment, easily replaced if they became tiresome or offensive. Imagine trying to tell a joke when your hands are clammy and your stomach is in knots because you saw the king frown a moment ago. Imagine the mental energy required to constantly analyze the room, the people, and especially the person whose whim dictated your fate. It wasn't just about being funny, it was about being psychologically astute to an almost pathological degree. You were a human barometer of royal humor, and every reading came with potentially fatal stakes. This era lacked the safety nets we take for granted. No sick days, no unemployment benefits, no legal protections. If the king decided he didn't like you anymore, that was it. Your career and possibly your life were over. This reality hovered over every performance, every witty remark, every moment you spent in the royal presence. It added a layer of tension and danger to the jester's life that is often completely overlooked in romanticized portrayals. Your most important skill wasn't juggling or joke-telling. It was survival, learned through the terrifying lens of your patron's perpetually unpredictable mood. So, you've mastered reading the royal tea leaves, becoming a finely tuned instrument for detecting the monarch's mood swings. You might even feel a flicker of confidence, a sense of belonging. You're in the room where it happens, witnessing power up close. But let's be brutally honest, being close to power doesn't mean you have power. Your social status in the medieval court was, to put it mildly, paradoxical. You were simultaneously closer to the king or queen than most nobles, seeing them in moments of vulnerability, sharing intimate spaces. And yet you were legally, socially, and often economically barely above the lowest servants. Think of it like this. You had a backstage pass to the biggest show in town, but your job was still sweeping the floors and sometimes getting kicked by the lead actor. You saw the fancy costumes, heard the important conversations, but your own clothes were probably patched, your living quarters cramped and drafty. And your opinion, while sometimes solicited under the guise of a joke, held no formal weight whatsoever. Your position was defined by its lack of definition. You didn't fit neatly into the rigid social hierarchy of nobility, clergy, merchants, or peasants. You were an anomaly, existing solely at the pleasure of the person at the very top. A mainstream historical fact illustrating this precariousness is that while some famous jesters like Rahire in England, reputed founder of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, though his jester status is debated, or Teste in France did accumulate wealth and favor, this was the absolute exception. For the vast majority, wealth was fleeting, consisting of gifts that could be revoked as easily as they were given. You might receive a fine coat one day, only for the king to demand it back or give it to someone else the next. You owned nothing of substance. No land, no titles, no inherited rights. Your entire livelihood was the royal favor, a currency more volatile than cryptocurrency in a meme crash. Legally, your status was often ambiguous, but it leaned heavily towards the servant class. You might be listed in court records alongside other staff members, not alongside the knights or ladies-in-waiting. In some grim instances, jesters, particularly those seen as natural fools, were treated almost as property included in inventories of assets. A quirky tidbit, there are records suggesting some jesters were bequeathed, in wills passed down from one generation of nobility to the next, like a piece of furniture or a favorite hunting dog. Imagine being written into a will right after my second best tapestry and 3 milking cows. To my heir, I leave my castle, my lands, and old Barnaby the funny guy. It's a stark reminder that despite the laughs, your life wasn't entirely your own. Your physical space in the castle reflected this. You weren't sleeping in a well-appointed chamber. You were likely in shared quarters, maybe slightly better than the stable lads or kitchen staff, but probably not by much. Cold, damp, and noisy, the constant reality of medieval castle living for anyone below the top tier. You smelled the wood smoke, the cooking food, the animals, and the ever-present underlying aroma of Well, let's just say hygiene wasn't a top priority for most folks. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from way back. It all contributed to the sensory backdrop of your low-status existence, a constant contrast to the silks and perfumes of the nobles you entertained. Historians still argue whether the Jester's low social status was a deliberate part of their function. Did being outside the formal hierarchy actually enable them to comment on it? Perhaps their lack of status made their pointed observations less threatening, allowing truths to be spoken because after all, it's just the fool talking. Right? Or was it simply a reflection of the fact that providing entertainment while valued was ultimately seen as a service, not a position of inherent worth? It's a complex question highlighting the unique position of the Jester as both insider and outsider. The uniform itself, the motley, the cap with bells, it reinforced your separation. It marked you as different as the licensed other. While it granted you permission to break social rules, it also prevented you from ever truly belonging to the structured world of the court. You were the perpetual outlier, the eccentric cousin nobody quite knew what to do with, but who was occasionally amusing to have around. You couldn't attend formal council meetings unless called upon for a specific odd reason. You weren't involved in diplomatic negotiations usually, and you certainly weren't marrying into noble families. The psychological toll of this must have been immense. To be constantly surrounded by wealth, power, and privilege, to interact intimately with those who possessed it, to rely entirely on their good graces for your survival, yet to know you were fundamentally a part disposable, it creates a profound sense of insecurity. Every laugh was a validation, every frown a potential disaster. You lived on the edge, sustained by performance and patronage, with no safety net below. It was the definition of a precarious position, high visibility, low security, a bizarre, unique role in the grand, boring, often uncomfortable drama of medieval life. Okay, so you've navigated the social tightrope of being a jester, living at the mercy of the king's moods in your own precarious status. You've learned that being a jester wasn't just about telling jokes. It was a complex, demanding, and often stressful gig. But the medieval court was a bustling ecosystem of people with all sorts of jobs, many of which were far less visible than the jester, and arguably even more tedious or unpleasant. While you were busy trying not to get your head removed for a bad pun, countless others were performing duties that ensured the castle actually functioned. Let's peek behind the curtain, beyond the fool's motley, to some of these less glamorous, more frankly boring or arduous court roles. Think about the sheer number of people needed to keep a large castle running. It wasn't just knights and ladies. There were cooks, bakers, brewers, stable hands, laundry women, cleaners, blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, tailors, chambermaids, and countless others. Many of these jobs were physically demanding, repetitive, and utterly lacking in prestige. Imagine being a scullion scrubbing pots and pans over a smoky fire for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. No weekends, no holidays, just endless grease and soot. Or a laundress hauling heavy wet fabrics and pounding them clean in cold water, your hands perpetually chapped and raw. These were essential roles, but incredibly hard work with little reward beyond basic subsistence. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval courts employed vast numbers of servants across a dizzying array of specialized roles. King Edward I of England's household in 1290, for instance, numbered over 500 people, most of whom were engaged in practical day-to-day labor. This gives you a sense of the scale of the required workforce. It wasn't just a handful of people. It was a small, self-contained village of workers supporting the noble household. Beyond the obvious manual labor, there were roles that sound slightly more official but were still incredibly tedious. Take the various roles responsible for managing supplies. You needed people to oversee the granary, the cellars for wine and ale, the larder for meat and cheese, and the buttery for drinks. The butler, for example, was originally in charge of the buttery, a role far less grand than the modern image. These jobs involved endless counting, checking stores, dealing with rot and pests, and keeping meticulous, if often inaccurate, records. Imagine spending your entire day inventorying sacks of grain, worrying about weevils. Riveting stuff. Then there were the roles focused on personal service to the nobles. The chamberlain, ostensibly a high-ranking officer, was historically in charge of the private chambers, managing wardrobes, ensuring privacy, and controlling access to the lord or lady. This could involve everything from helping them dress to literally standing guard outside their door. While this offered proximity to power, it also meant being constantly on call, dealing with the often demanding and sometimes unpleasant habits of your employer. A quirky tidbit, the groom of the stool was a position of surprisingly high rank in English court, specifically tasked with assisting the king with his bodily functions. Yes, you read that right. It involved carrying the king's portable toilet, the stool, and assisting him when nature called. While it sounds utterly demeaning today, the intimacy it afforded the holder meant they often became trusted confidants, privy to private thoughts and conversations. Still, a job title wasn't quite head of royal strategy. Was it more like chief poop pal? Historians still argue about the level of agency individuals in these service roles possessed. Were they simply cogs in a machine living lives of unremitting toil? Or did they find ways to carve out small areas of autonomy, form communities, or even exert subtle influence through their access and knowledge? It's difficult to say, as their lives are less well documented than those of nobles or even famous jesters. Their stories are often buried in the mundane details of household accounts and regulations. Other less than glamorous roles, the falconer's assistants who spent their days cleaning out bird mews and handling sharp-taloned birds of prey. The stable hands constantly mucking out stalls and smelling perpetually of horse and manure. The messengers who faced the dangers and discomforts of medieval travel, will get to that, just to deliver a sealed letter. The people who maintained the castle's plumbing, or lack thereof, dealing with latrines and cesspits. These were essential jobs performed by real people living real, often unpleasant lives. Contrast this with the jester's role. While the jester faced mental and emotional strain, the dangers of royal caprice and social ambiguity, many other court roles involved sheer back-breaking physical labor, mind-numbing repetition, and constant exposure to unsanitary conditions. The jester's life, with its moments of performance interaction and potential, however slight, for influencing the powerful, might actually look relatively stimulating compared to spending your days turning a spit or hauling water buckets. It puts the jester's sucking into perspective. It sucked in a different, more psychologically fraught way than the physical misery endured by the majority of the castle's inhabitants. All right, so we've wandered through the castle grounds, peeked at the various physical labors, and considered the jester's unique blend of psychological stress and social limbo. Now let's move indoors into a quieter but no less arduous corner of court life, the scriptorium, or wherever the medieval equivalent of an office happened to be. This is where the scribes and clerks toiled, dealing with the absolute mountain of paperwork that medieval administration, however rudimentary by modern standards, still generated. And let me tell you, if you think your inbox is overflowing, try copying every single email by hand in Latin with a scratchy quill on expensive, imperfect parchment. Your life as a scribe was one of quiet, relentless monotony. Day after day, you would sit hunched over a desk, copying documents, charters, royal decrees, legal rulings, inventories. Remember those folks counting grain? Someone had to write it down, official correspondence. And occasionally, if you were lucky and worked for a monastery or a wealthy patron, maybe a religious text or even a bit of literature. But mostly it was the dry, repetitive business of record keeping. Imagine spending years just copying lists of names and numbers, or endless paragraphs of legal jargon that even lawyers today would find dense. The tools of your trade were simple yet demanding. A quill pen which needed constant sharpening with a knife, hence the term pen-knife quirky tidbit. Ink, which you might have to mix yourself from soot oak galls or other natural pigments, often a messy process. And parchment or vellum made from animal skins, which was expensive and varied in quality, sometimes bumpy, sometimes stained, always requiring careful preparation. Errors were a disaster. A single slip of the quill could ruin a whole page of costly parchment, and correcting mistakes involved carefully scraping away the ink with a sharp knife. A process called erasure. Literal erasure, which could easily damage the writing surface. Imagine accidentally typing pubic instead of public and having to literally scrape your computer screen with a razor blade. Stressful. This was tedious historical paperwork on a grand scale. There was no Ctrl+C, no spell check, no backspace key. Every letter was formed individually, every word, every line with painstaking care. Your hands would cramp, your back would ache from hunching, and your eyes would sting in the dim light often provided only by flickering candles, a fire hazard in a room full of dry parchment. The silence was probably deafening compared to the rest of the castle, broken only by the scratching of quills and the occasional cough or sigh of despair. A mainstream historical fact is the sheer volume of administrative documents produced in royal and noble households, churches, and monasteries across medieval Europe. Records like the Domesday Book in England, commissioned by William the Conqueror, represent an incredible if boring logistical achievement, requiring countless scribes to survey and record land ownership and value across the entire country. Imagine being one of the poor souls tasked with copying column after column of land valuations and peasant holdings. Farmer Giles owns 3 pigs and owes 2 shillings. Next page. Farmer John owns 1 cow and owes 3 shillings. Riveting stuff for bedtime. The monotony wasn't just in the copying. Clerks also had to organize these documents, file them often in chests or on shelves, in damp conditions leading to their decay over time, and retrieve them when needed. This was early bureaucracy in its most rudimentary form. While modern offices have filing cabinets and databases, medieval clerks had to rely on memory-simple indexing systems and physically sifting through piles of parchment rolls or bound volumes. Historians still argue whether scribes saw their work as merely a trade, or if those copying religious texts or literature felt a deeper sense of purpose or artistry. Was the act of copying a beautiful illuminated manuscript a spiritual practice or just a job requiring fine motor skills? For the clerks copying endless financial accounts, the answer is probably leaning heavily towards just a job, please pay me. The dangers of this role weren't sudden death from offending a king. They were slow, cumulative, and debilitating. Poor eyesight from working in dim light, chronic pain from bad posture, respiratory issues from smoky, poorly ventilated rooms. You were unlikely to be beheaded, but you might be blind and crippled by the time you were 40. A quirky tidbit, some scribes would leave small notes or drawings in the margins of manuscripts known as marginalia, sometimes complaining about the cold, the difficulty of the text, or just drawing silly pictures. Imagine finding a 1,000-year-old drawing of a rabbit fighting a snail in the margin of a tax record, clearly the medieval equivalent of doodling during a boring meeting. My hand is cramped, the ink is thick, and I wish I was anywhere but here. Scrawled next to a beautifully rendered capital letter. Compared to the Jester, the scribe's life lacked the peaks of potential favor and the dramatic cliffhangers of royal displeasure. It was a flatter, grayer existence. You had slightly more job security than a Jester. Governments always need paperwork, but zero chance of becoming a royal confidant through wit and charm. Your value was purely in your literacy and diligence skills, possessed by relatively few people, which gave you a certain quiet importance, but not power or excitement. So while the Jester was juggling chainsaws metaphorically for laughs, the scribe was painstakingly copying instruction manuals for juggling, making sure every comma was in the right place. Both jobs sucked, but in vastly different, equally unappealing ways. One was a high-wire act of performance in politics. The other was a slow, relentless grind of ink parchment and soul-crushing repetition. We've journeyed from the Jester's dangerous stage to the scribe's dusty corner. Now let's delve into some of the genuinely unpleasant manual and medical jobs that existed in history jobs that make scrubbing pots or copying documents seem almost appealing. These are the roles that dealt with the messiest, most bodily, and frankly most disgusting aspects of life before modern sanitation and medicine. If you thought the Jester's life was uncomfortable, prepare yourself for tasks involving, well, let's just say biological hazards. One of the most infamous roles involves dealing with human waste. We touched on the groom of the stool, a surprisingly intimate and high-ranking position, but lower down the ladder were the people who actually had to empty the castle's latrines and cesspits. These were often simple holes or shafts, leading down to a pit, and they needed to be emptied periodically. This job, sometimes referred to euphemistically, was back-breaking, noxious work. Imagine climbing down into a pit filled with accumulated human waste in the dark, with only basic tools and shoveling it out. The smell alone would be enough to send most of us running. There were no hazmat suits, no masks, no disinfectant. Just you, a shovel, and centuries of accumulated material. A mainstream historical fact is that poor sanitation was a major factor in the spread of disease throughout history, and the people tasked with managing waste-faced, constant exposure to pathogens. Speaking of things that make you gag, let's talk about healthcare, or what passed for it. Being a medieval doctor was a mixed bag. Some had genuine knowledge derived from ancient texts or limited observation, but many relied on superstition, guesswork, and truly horrifying practices. Forget sterile environments and anesthesia. Procedures were often performed with dirty tools and unsanitary conditions, and the treatments were frequently painful, ineffective, or actively harmful. One of the most widely used and enduring yet completely ineffective medical practices was bloodletting. The belief was that illness was caused by an imbalance of the body's humors, blood phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and letting blood was supposed to restore balance. This job often fell to barbers who had sharp instruments readily available. So, your local medieval barber wasn't just giving haircuts. They were also your go-to for being deliberately bled, sometimes to the point of weakness or even death. Imagine going for a trim and being asked, "Right, sir, just a little off the top. And how much blood would you like drained today?" A quirky tidbit: leeches were frequently used for bloodletting. Sometimes multiple leeches applied to the patient at once. Yes, someone's job was literally leech wrangling, collecting them, storing them, and applying them to sick people. Imagine the job interview, so your duties will include handling live parasites that suck blood. Oh, right, sounds sticky. Beyond bloodletting, think about surgical procedures without anesthesia. Setting broken bones, amputations, lancing boils, or abscesses. All done with the patient wide awake, possibly given a bit of alcohol for the pain, but mostly just having to grit their teeth and endure agony. Someone had to perform these procedures. Someone had to hold the patient down. These weren't glamorous roles. They were grim necessities performed by people who had likely seen immense suffering and dealt with unimaginable sights and smells on a daily basis. Historians still argue whether medieval medical practitioners were genuinely trying to help based on the best knowledge available to them, or if many were simply charlatans preying on the sick and desperate. The reality is probably a mix, with some individuals possessing genuine skill within the limitations of their era, while others were simply performing rituals and prescribing bizarre remedies. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen? Well, that was a cosmetic. Medical remedies could be far, far worse, involving animal parts, ground up precious stones, expensive and useless or foul-smelling concoctions of herbs and animal excretions. Someone had to gather, prepare, and administer these remedies. Another genuinely unpleasant historical job, the tanner. Tanning leather involved soaking animal hides in vats of foul-smelling chemicals, often including urine or animal dung, to preserve them and make them pliable. It was a trade confined to the outskirts of towns due to the horrific smell. The tanners themselves were often seen as social outcasts covered in grime and perpetually reeking. Hard, dirty, noxious work essential for producing leather goods, but utterly miserable for the people doing it. Compare this to the jester. The jester's job was psychologically taxing and physically uncomfortable in its own way. Cold, damp performance stress, but it rarely involved wading through human waste, handling leeches, or performing rudimentary agonizing surgery. The scribe's life was monotonous and physically debilitating over time, but it was clean indoors work. These roles, the pit cleaner, the barber surgeon, the tanner, represent a different category of historical suckiness, one defined by direct, unavoidable exposure to filth, disease, pain, and bodily unpleasantness. It serves as a stark reminder of how basic and difficult life was for the vast majority of people, whose jobs weren't entertaining or clerical, but simply keeping the essential and often gross functions of society stumbling along. Your worst day as a jester probably didn't involve scraping feces off the bottom of a pit. Just something to think about. Okay, so we've explored the messy and monotonous jobs within the confines of the castle and town. Now let's talk about leaving the relative. Well, relative being the key word here. Safety of those walls. Because medieval people, including jesters who often traveled with the court, didn't stay put. They traveled. And medieval travel? Oh boy, medieval travel sucked. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was slow, dangerous, and utterly unpredictable. Forget paved roads, comfortable carriages with suspension, or even reliable maps. Most roads were little more than dirt tracks, deeply rutted by cartwheels, often turning into muddy quagmires in the rain, or dusty bone-jarring paths in the dry. Rivers had to be forded or crossed by unreliable ferries. Forests and mountains were obstacles, not scenic routes. Traveling even a short distance, what we'd consider a quick drive today, could take days or even weeks. A journey of 100 miles might take a week on horseback, assuming good conditions. By foot, much longer. For a large group like a royal court moving with all its people and possessions, it was a massive logistical undertaking crawling along at the pace of the slowest wagons. Medieval travel woes started the moment you left the castle gates. The most common way to travel was on horseback. If you were important, you might have a decent horse. If you were less so, maybe a scrawny pony or even walking alongside carts. There were no cushioned saddles by modern standards, just leather over a wooden frame. Hours in that saddle meant saddle sores, aching muscles, and bone fatigue. Carriages existed, but they were essentially wooden boxes on wheels without suspension. Every bump in the road was transmitted directly to your spine. Imagine bouncing along for hours being tossed around like dice in a cup. Nausea, bruises, and a constant headache were standard companions. Beyond the physical discomfort, there was constant danger. Bandits and highwaymen were a very real threat. Traveling parties, especially wealthy ones like a royal court, were tempting targets. You had to be constantly vigilant, relying on any guards who were present. The wilderness areas you traveled through were wild. Dangerous animals were a possibility, but more likely was simply getting lost, especially in unfamiliar territory with unreliable directions. Weather was another major factor. Remember those muddy quagmires? Rain could turn roads impassable, forcing long detours or stranding travelers for days. Snow and ice in winter made travel incredibly dangerous, if not impossible. Finding shelter could be difficult. While monasteries and castles sometimes offered hospitality, particularly to important travelers, lesser folk like jesters and the retinue would often have to camp outdoors exposed to the elements or seek refuge in overcrowded flea-ridden inns that offered little comfort and questionable food. A mainstream historical fact is that the infrastructure for travel was vastly different and less developed than in the Roman era or modern times. While some old Roman roads still existed, many had fallen into disrepair and new road building was limited and haphazard. This lack of good roads significantly hampered communication trade and the ability of rulers to quickly move troops or administer distant parts of their realms. Finding decent food and water along the way was a gamble. You were reliant on what you could carry, what you could forage if you had the skills and opportunity, or what you could buy or beg for in villages or at inns. Food was often monotonous, poorly preserved, and prone to causing digestive upset. Water sources might be contaminated. Remember the general lack of hygiene we discussed that didn't just apply to castles, it was a feature of the landscape. Historians still argue about the true extent of banditry and the level of safety on medieval roads. Was it a constant, pervasive threat, or were attacks relatively rare outside of specific troubled regions? The perception of danger was certainly high, and rulers often struggled to maintain order in their territories, making travel inherently risky. For a jester traveling with the court, your job didn't stop just because you were on the road. You were still expected to entertain during stops, to lift spirits during a miserable day of travel, and to be ready to perform upon arrival, however exhausted you might be. Imagine trying to be funny after spending 10 hours bouncing on a cart covered in dust or mud, hungry and sore. A quirky tidbit: some traveling jesters might have supplemented their income or food supply by performing for local villagers or at smaller manor houses along the route, outside of their official court duties. Every audience, every opportunity to earn your keep had to be seized. The cumulative effect of this travel was constant discomfort and fatigue. You were always exposed, always vulnerable. Your body ached. Your stomach was probably upset, and sleep was likely sporadic and uncomfortable. This wasn't a quick business trip. It was a grueling endurance test repeated whenever the court moved. While the jester might escape the deepest pits of physical labor back at the castle, the demands of constant, uncomfortable, and dangerous travel added a whole new layer of suckiness to the job. Reminding you that even when you weren't performing for the king, you were still enduring the harsh realities of the medieval world. So you've endured the bone-jarring travel, the constant threat of bandits, the questionable food and water, and you finally arrived, feeling like absolute rubbish. Maybe you picked up a fever from that drafty inn, or perhaps you twisted your ankle when the cart hit a particularly nasty rut. Now you need medical attention. And this, my friend, is where things can go from merely uncomfortable to truly terrifying. Forget the clean, sterile environments and effective painkillers you might be used to. Medieval medicine operated on entirely different principles with often agonizing results. Your understanding of why you were sick was probably based on the prevailing theories of the time. Maybe you had an imbalance of humors. Too much phlegm, perhaps, if you had a cold. Maybe you'd been exposed to bad air, the dreaded miasma, which was thought to carry disease. Or perhaps in a more spiritual sense, you were being punished for your sins. Diagnosis was often based on examining your urine, your pulse, or just your general appearance. Subtle cues were everything because the actual internal workings of the body were largely a mystery. Dissection was often forbidden or severely restricted. Seeking treatment meant finding someone who practiced healing arts. This could be a learned physician, rare and expensive, often educated in places like Salerno or Montpellier. Mainstream historical fact: a local barber surgeon, more common, dealt with external injuries and simple procedures. A wise woman or folk healer in the village, or monks in a monastery infirmary. Their methods varied wildly, but pain relief as we know it, effective anesthesia, simply didn't exist. Maybe a bit of alcohol, or if you were lucky, some opium or mandrake, but these were unreliable and dangerous themselves. So you've got that throbbing ankle or that burning fever. What happens? You might be prescribed a complex herbal concoction. Some herbs had genuine medicinal properties, but they were often mixed with completely useless or even harmful ingredients. Remember those bizarre remedies? You might be made to vomit or undergo a strong purge to expel bad humors from your body. Imagine being deliberately given something to make you violently ill on top of already feeling terrible. It's like being told the best way to fix your computer virus is to hit it repeatedly with a hammer. And yes, bloodletting was still a popular go-to. We mentioned leeches back in section 7, and they might make another appearance here. Or a barber might simply cut a vein and let you bleed into a bowl. The idea was to remove excess humors, but it often just weakened the patient, further making them more susceptible to other problems. You could easily lose a significant amount of blood, leaving you dizzy, weak, and still very much sick. Feeling a bit faint, are we? Yes, that's just the humors adjusting. We'll let a bit more. If you had a broken bone setting, it was an excruciating process done by feel, often without effective splints or casts initially. Wounds were cleaned, if at all, with water or wine, and then poultices of herbs or other substances were applied. Infection was rampant, a constant terrifying risk. Remember the general lack of hygiene. Simple cuts could turn deadly. Surgery, when absolutely necessary, like amputating a gangrenous limb, was a brutal last-ditch effort performed quickly and agonizingly with basic, often non-sterile tools. The scream you heard from the next room might well be someone undergoing a procedure that would make modern dentistry feel like a spa treatment. A quirky tidbit about medieval remedies: one common treatment for various ailments involved applying a poultice made of warm animal dung. Yes, warm poop applied to your skin. The logic was unclear, based perhaps on a vague idea of heat or natural properties, But the reality was messy, smelly, and probably more likely to introduce infection than cure anything. Imagine the conversation, "Doctor, I have a terrible cough." "Ah, yes, the humors are unsettled. Here, apply this warm cow pat to your chest. That'll sort it." Are you serious? Historians still argue about the overall effectiveness of medieval medicine. Did the herbal remedies sometimes work because some plants do have medicinal properties? Or were any improvements seen primarily due to the body healing itself? Or simply the placebo effect bolstered by faith and ritual? It's hard to isolate the true impact of their interventions from the body's natural resilience. Being sick in the medieval period wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a gamble. You were at the mercy of theories that were fundamentally wrong treatments that were often painful and ineffective, and practitioners whose knowledge was severely limited by superstition and lack of understanding. You endured discomfort, pain, and fear, hoping that somehow, despite the best efforts of your physician to purge or bleed you into submission, your body would just figure it out. Your jester's wit wouldn't save you from the leeches, and your tumbling skills wouldn't mend a broken leg painlessly. Just another layer of the deeply unpleasant reality of life when even trying to get better involved significant suffering. All right, we've reached the end of our journey through history's less than ideal professions and discomforts. We've seen the jester's precarious dance with death, the scribe's numbingly repetitive task, the pit cleaner's grim reality, and the sheer agony of medieval medicine and travel. But beyond these specific roles and events, there was a pervasive, underlying level of physical discomfort that was simply the norm for most people living in the past. It wasn't tied to a specific job, it was just life. And it adds another layer to why so many historical existences truly sucked even in their quieter, non-dramatic moments. Imagine a world without central heating or air conditioning. Castles and homes were drafty cold in the winter and stuffy in the summer. Keeping warm required huddling around fires, which filled rooms with smoke, or wearing multiple layers of often scratchy woolen clothing. Keeping cool involved finding shade and hoping for a breeze. There was no escaping the temperature. Your body was constantly adjusting, constantly enduring. Sleep was often interrupted by cold, heat, insects, or noise. Hygiene, as we've hinted at repeatedly, was a major source of constant low-level misery. Remember the lack of proper sanitation. Well, that extended to personal cleanliness too. Regular bathing was less common for many people than it is today, often due to the sheer effort required to heat large amounts of water. Clothing was difficult to wash effectively and dried slowly. This meant many people lived with persistent body odor, greasy hair, and itchy skin. Lice and fleas were incredibly common problems for all social classes, a constant source of irritation and discomfort. Imagine trying to deliver a witty line as a jester while secretly scratching a flea bite on your neck. It adds a certain realism. Food was often monotonous, lacking in nutrients and prone to spoilage. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal and not always readily available. Remember those logistical nightmares of travel and supply? Diets were often heavy on grains, sometimes supplemented with whatever meat or fish could be acquired. Malnutrition was common, leading to a range of health problems. Preserving food was difficult. Salting, smoking, and pickling were common methods, but they altered the taste and nutritional value. Food poisoning was a frequent risk. There were no refrigeration standards or hygiene regulations for food preparation. Your stomach probably hurt quite a lot of the time. A quirky tidbit: medieval people often drank more ale or weak beer than water, partly because fermented drinks were less likely to carry waterborne diseases, but also simply because water sources were often polluted. So a constant mild buzz might have been one of the few reliefs from the general discomfort. Even simple things like clothing were less comfortable. Fabrics were often rougher than modern textiles. Shoes were less supportive and comfortable. Many people went barefoot some of the time, risking injury and infection. Dental hygiene was practically non-existent by modern standards. Tooth decay, abscesses, and tooth loss were common problems causing chronic pain. Imagine living with a constant toothache and no painkillers. Historians still argue about the average lifespan and overall health of medieval populations. While infant mortality was terribly high, those who survived childhood could sometimes live long lives, but often with the cumulative effects of poor diet, chronic infections, and physical hardship taking their toll. Was the general level of discomfort something people simply grew accustomed to, or was it a constant source of low-grade suffering? Think about the Jester again. Remember that figure balancing laughter and fear. He lived with all these underlying discomforts, just like everyone else. The cold stone floors, the smells of the castle, the possibility of parasites, the aches from travel, the questionable food. These were the background noise of his life amplified by the stress of his unique profession. It's a mainstream historical fact that even the wealthiest people in the medieval period lacked many of the basic comforts and hygienic standards we take for granted today. A king might wear silk, but he still dealt with fleas and drafted rooms. So while the Jester's specific job had unique stresses, the fundamental sucks of medieval existence, the lack of comfort, the poor hygiene, the unpredictable food, the constant threat of minor illnesses becoming major, remember those agonizing medical treatments? Were shared by almost everyone. It puts their struggles, their performances, their brief moments of levity into a starker context. They were trying to make people laugh, trying to survive, all while navigating a world that was fundamentally uncomfortable and frequently unpleasant in ways we can only imagine today. Their lot might have sucked in high-stakes ways, but the baseline level of suck was incredibly high for everyone around them too. And that brings us to the end of our look at why being a medieval court jester, and frankly just living back then for most people, really wasn't a walk in the park. It was a tough, demanding, and often deeply uncomfortable existence full of hard work, low status, constant threats, and a level of basic physical misery that's hard for us to truly grasp from our climate-controlled, sanitized, pain-managed lives. As the images of drafty castles, dusty roads, and uncertain smiles begin to fade, let the sound soften. The clatter of dishes, the distant horn, the nervous laugh of a jester. They quiet down now. Feel the quiet settle around you. The journey back through the less glamorous parts of history is complete for tonight. You can let go of the tension, the worry about royal moods or itchy wool. The cold stones are far away. The ink has dried on the page. The leeches have, well, they're gone. It's time to leave those discomforts behind. Just the sound of my voice soft now and the gentle hum of the fan guiding you. Back to comfort, back to quiet. The worries of the past are just stories carried on the breeze. There's nothing left to do now but drift. Let the stillness find you. Find your own soft spot. Let the quiet hold you. Sleep calls now. Just ease into rest.